Yeah, it's fair to say that the free schools programme in this country is still in its very early stages. We've only got about 11 schools which are planned to open in September. And like any project in its early stage, the critics it's prone to attack. It's prone to attack, I think, particularly at the moment from the point of view that it's going to accentuate a two-tier system of education in this country. It's prone to attack from the view that potentially for-profit might get involved, and that that will automatically jeopardise the well-being of our children. I think these arguments need to be addressed head-on. These are arguments which we at Policy Exchange have addressed head-on and will continue to do so. But rather than just engage in that academic debate, I think what better place to look than Sweden, and what better authority to speak on this than Mikael Sandström, who's standing beside me tonight. Mikael is currently the State Secretary in the Prime Minister's office in Sweden. Now, he assures me that that is a role which does not mean he is the Minister for Education in Sweden, but he is here tonight as someone who has a long track record in free schools in Sweden. He's done a lot of academic research in that, and so I can't think of anybody else better to speak on the subject. So please, let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you. You forgot to mention that I'm also a member of Parliament, even though I'm on leave. And I got a very good title for this speak, the Swedish perspective on free schools, because it doesn't say anything really. So I can pretty much choose what I want to say myself. So the first thing I had to sort out was which hat to wear, because I'm an elected politician for the Conservative Party, even though I'm on leave. And as State Secretary is something very strange from a British perspective. At the one hand, I'm appointed by the Prime Minister, so I'm a political appointee. On the other hand, I'm also formally a civil servant, so I could theoretically stand here as a civil servant and explain to you the policies of the Swedish government in a sort of non-political way. But I decided that the most fun, or most interesting would be to revert to academia and take on my hat as Doctor of Economics. And there are a couple of reasons for that. The first reason is that, of course, having been out of research for a number of years, I miss it in a way, even though it's fun not always to have to know what you're talking about, which I have to do when we're in academia. In politics, the big difference is that in academia, usually the conclusion has to follow from the analysis. That's not always the case in politics. But also, I think it's my wife is a doctor, and well, we met at a conference of the youth organization of the Conservative Party. So obviously, we talk a lot about politics. And one thing we often talk about is that you would never accept a physician, a doctor, to act in the way that your politicians do. Because you want your doctor to use treatments that are based on evidence, while you expect your politicians, well, I don't know, but one of the inventions, I would say, of the new moderates when they started to remodel our party after the disastrous election of 2002 was actually that we wanted, as far as possible, to try to build policy on evidence. And that's why I've tried to take a slightly academic line. And well, what is my background? I got a PhD in 1999, and after that I started to work at a private research institute that had been commissioned by the Swedish government, but a sort of semi-autonomous body to write a report on the free schools. And one of the really big issues at the time was whether the free schools hurt children in the public schools or not. That was sort of the main argument against the free schools. The reform had been underway for a couple of years, and the main arguments against the free schools was that they hurt the public schools, or I shouldn't say public schools in Britain, I've understood. I should say the government schools, but they weren't run by the government, they were run by the local government, so we call them municipal schools, but you know what I mean, those that aren't privately run. We began to work on a report in 2000, which was published for the government in 2001. We refined it into a scientific paper and sent it to the Journal of Public Economics in 2002, and it takes some time, so it got published in 2005. And I tried to focus on, so what I do, I actually focus on one question, is this question. Has the free school reform been good or bad for Swedish students? And my answer is that it's been good. And of course, now you start to suspect that I haven't made the transfer back to being an academic quite as thoroughly as one might want, because academics usually don't speak with such confidence, but I'll try to explain to you why I confidently say that the free schools in Sweden have been good for Swedish students. Going back to my wife's profession, when you test a new medicine, you want to do something like this. This is something I got from Wikipedia, which describes a randomized controlled trial. What you really would like to do is to take kids from a population and randomly select some kids to put in independent schools and some in non-independent schools. I'll call them public schools, you have to bear up with that. Then after a while, 40 years or so, when their professional career has ended, try to assess whether or not those who went to the free schools had a better outcome than those who didn't. Ideally, it should also be a blinded test, so that neither the students, the teacher, nor the researcher know beforehand whether or not the school is private. That's how you undertake tests of a new drug. And the reason I go through that is that, well, in social sciences, we can't do like that. We have a situation that is something like this. We want to see what happens to school quality. We try to measure them in some kind of way with grades or test results. We have something that happens, the establishment of free schools or school choice. We have a lot of background noise. We have the municipalities that run schools in Sweden. They have changed resources, they have made political changes, they have different attitudes towards schooling, how important schooling is as compared to municipal waste or other important matters. We have students and parents who have different backgrounds, different education background. Parents have different education backgrounds. They may be immigrants, perhaps they don't even know Swedish or English. They have different income and different value. And then you want to, then all of these interact in mysterious ways. They interact and not in a clean way, not as we want a randomized trial where you have sort of a straight line of interaction, but you have a very complex picture, and then you want to isolate one single thing, how competition or how the establishment of free schools influence quality. And well, how are you going to sort out one factor in this mess? And what we did was to try to first split the complex question into two. We said to ourselves that, well, economists talk about something called revealed preferences. If I choose a Saab instead of a Volvo, well, then the combination of price, quality, and other characteristics offered by Saab are, by revealed preferences, better to me than those offered by Volvo. So sort of self-evident. And we said, why don't we say the same thing about schools? If parents and children choose the free schools, then that's a sign that they think that the free schools are better. It might sound as a simple simple assumption, but it's to some it's a heroic assumption, because we can't expect parents to know their own best or their children's best and so on. But to me, it's quite a natural assumption. And the second question, which is much more important, I think, is if free schools hurt the other schools, the public schools. Because even if the children who go to the free schools are happy and get a better education, that would still be a problem to me if it hurt the other children, if it left the other children behind. But I'll start with the first question and just also offer some figures of this quite spectacular development we've had in Sweden since we introduced free schools. First, if we look at the number of students in free schools since the reform started. This is both upper secondary school and compulsory school, and the number have gone from 18,000 to 180,000 over this time period. And that is out of a total student population of about 1.25 billion, so it's still a small fraction. And the increase then is around 160,000, and the total number of students in Sweden has increased by about 80,000. So you could say that the entire increase in the student population has been absorbed by the free schools, and in addition they have taken 80,000 students from the public schools, from the ordinary school system. It doesn't look quite as impressive if we take this picture instead, which are in the blue are the municipal students going to, or pupils going to municipal schools, and what color is it? Red or something. Of the pupils going to independent schools. You see, it's still a very small fraction, but it's an increase from 2% to 11% for the independent schools. And another thing you can see is that we have a demographic change that, well, to begin with, the independent schools, the free schools, could absorb students from an increase in the student population, but from around 2000 we've had a declining student population, and the free schools are still continuing to grow. And if we look at the upper secondary schools, we have an even more spectacular increase from below 2% to over almost a quarter, to 24%. But as I said, as I started out by saying, I'm not that worried about the students in the free schools. There is evidence that the free schools are outperforming the public schools. But as I said, I would still be troubled if it was true that the free schools take resources from the public schools with the result that that those schools are hurt, that students perform worse. And that was what I and my co-author, Dr. Bergström, set out to explore. We said to ourselves, let's look just at the public schools and see if competition from the free schools improve or decrease quality in the public schools. Now, and the picture I showed you, how do we sort out that mess? Well, have to do with a lot of things. There are a number of methodological challenges that you have to deal with when you analyze school choice, when you analyze any kind of school policy. We have to control for student backgrounds. We know that students aren't identical, so we have in some way to try to control for that kind of background variables. Parents' income, educational background, if they're immigrants or not, and so on. And then we have to take account of self-selection. The neat picture I showed you, where you randomize students, doesn't apply because it's a conscious decision which school you're going to go to. So the students aren't randomly assigned. So that's one of the challenges you have to take account of. You have to take account of something called endogeneity, which is basically that the treatment could be a function of patient characteristics. It could be that the free schools are established where the environment is especially friendly, where the schools are good, the students are problem-free. Or it could be that the free schools are established where the ordinary schools are particularly lousy. That's an open question, and you have to in some way address that issue methodologically. Since we're not doing a randomized trial, you have to get down to data and try to in some way isolate out all those different effects. And then you have to find an appropriate measure of student achievement. We know that grades are set by teachers. One hypothesis has been that competition tends to make teachers be more generous in their grading practices. We haven't found any evidence of that, but it's possible, so you have to see if you can find good test data, then what kind of test should you use, etc., etc. And then you have to take account of the fact that whatever estimates you're making are uncertain. What we're doing really is that don't let anyone of my friends in academia say this, but what academics basically do when they're doing statistics is to guess. They look out and take data and then they guess. But they're doing an educated guess, a very educated guess. They try to take account of all different factors that might influence a particular connection between what you want to, the output variable and the different input variables. But basically you're still making a guess, and you have to be very careful of how you assess the uncertainty of your guess. How sure can we be of this guess? And that's one of the most important methodological issues, to try to assess how certain you can be of what you're guessing. So what we did was, we had a database of 28,000 students. We had data from 33 Swedish municipalities. Of course, ideally we would have liked to have all students, which is 100 students in a cohort. We took data of only 9th graders. We would have liked to have data from all municipalities, not just 33, but we couldn't get data. By some strange reason, the Swedish National Board of Education doesn't collect data from all 290 municipalities, but only from 33. We had data on test results and grades. We had data on family background. We had data on a couple of political variables in the municipalities to try to make some kind of assessment of how friendly the political atmosphere are to free choices, to the establishment of independent schools. And we also had, because obviously one potentially very serious mistake you could make is to say that, okay, we find that the grades in municipalities where there are many independent schools are higher than in other municipalities, when in fact the reason is that free schools only get established in municipalities with good grades. Then of course our results would be entirely spurious. It's like the example of the number of fire and the fire brigade. The more fires you have, the more fire brigades you have, the more fires there are in a city. And that the conclusion is not that you should reduce the number of fire brigades, because the correlation is the reverse. But to eliminate the possibility of a reverse correlation, that our results are really the reason why free schools are established, we had also the grades, the average grades in the municipalities before the reform, and used that as a means of trying to control for the establishment of independent schools. So what we did was, basically we had 3 models. We had one model trying to explain why free schools get started, We had one model explaining why students choose free schools. And we had one model, sort of the output model, trying to explain student results with free schools as one of the explanatory variables. And all of these assumptions, they can be questioned, they can be criticized. We can make terrible mistakes. And the question we always have to ask ourselves, because what we did, we threw in the data, we ran a really simple model, and we got the result that independent schools have a positive effect on the quality of schooling in the public schools. That was the first model we ran. The first statistical test we made gave us that result. And then we worked basically for 3 years trying to destroy our own results. Trying to find out whether or not this conclusion was right or wrong. Was the model correctly specified? Well, what's the only way to test that? You have to try different kinds of models. You have to have different combination of variables. You have to have alternative variables. One way to measure family background is perhaps the wrong way. Throw in another variable. It could be something wrong with the data. So what we did was we tried to run the model instead of on a subset of the data. We eliminated first one municipality at a time, then we eliminated 2 municipalities at a time, because one criticism we got was that the results were driven by some strange municipalities that had very special characteristics. So we did that. We just eliminated first 1, first 2, and then 3 number of the municipalities in all different combinations. And we used a different approach with entirely different data. So basically, we just tested, and we ran over 30,000 different model specifications and combinations of data. As I said, we spent a couple of years systematically trying to destroy our own results, but they still held. They still held. We sent the article to a journal, and they asked a couple of questions, and we ran another couple of thousand regressions, sent it back, and they said, could you look at this issue and this issue also? And finally we got it back, and they said, now it's good, but make it shorter. And the remarkable thing is the consistency of our results. However we specify the model, we find a positive effect of competition on students' results in the municipal schools. And also we find no evidence that academically weak students are hurt. And also, I've seen a couple of papers and journal articles in the UK claiming that some of the other studies addressing the same problem as we're addressing, but using different methods and different approaches, give different results. Well, they give different results, but in essence, it gives the same result. That is, that there is a positive effect from competition on students' results in the municipal sector. There are differences between these studies. As I said, there are a number of different methodological challenges you have to deal with. In sorting out these challenges, you can use different approaches. But whatever approach you use, you basically end up with the same kind of results. There is a positive effect from competition on students' results in the municipal studies. And to me, it's quite amazing that some of these studies have been used as an argument against vouchers. And one of the claims is that it is true, they don't find, the claim is they don't find a consistent positive result, which basically means that not all combination of variables, not all result variables show a positive result from free choice. There are, to my knowledge, no study that has shown a systematic negative result from competition. But saying that the fact that you don't, in every possible combination, get a positive result from competition is the same as saying that it's not good with school choice. It's like saying that we shouldn't use radiotherapy because it doesn't show a consistently good result on treating patients, because some patients still die. And I give you a couple of quotes from a few of these studies that I have seen in British media as an argument against the free schools. And first one from one of the best studies, which is Böhlmark and Lindahl, which says that an increase in the private school share by 10 percentage points increases average pupil achievement by almost 1 percentile rank point. Another interesting thing is they distinguish between an attendance effect, that is the effect from students going to free schools that are better. They find that free schools perform better than the public schools, and a competition effect, which is the effect of improved results in the public schools due to competition. And they find that the main part of the achievement effect is due to more competition in the school sector, forcing schools to improve their quality. Which is also a powerful argument against the claim that free schools should hurt the public schools. Böhlmark and Lindahl wrote another paper where they took the analysis one step further. They find that increasing private school share moderately improves short-term educational outcomes such as whatever, but they do not find any impact on medium or long-term educational outcomes such as high school, GPA, university attainment, or years of schooling. Now, as I said, I spent quite some time trying to destroy my own results, but they're taking it a step further. We have schools. We know very little about what creates good results in schools, actually, if we look at science. And we know that student background is an overwhelming determinant of student outcome. If you have highly educated parents, you are likely to get a good academic outcome yourself. And then we have a share of competition that varies between 0 and 10%, or something, or a little bit higher, perhaps 20%. And then you want to study the outcome in terms of academic achievement at the university several years later. And you don't find an effect, and you claim that that is surprising. I would have said it would have been extremely surprising if they had found any effect at all. And above all, it's still not an argument against free schools because it doesn't claim that there is an adverse effect. As I said, there is remarkable that we find any effect at all. We have a serious lack of good data in Sweden. It's strange. You would think that Sweden have had a registry of everyone living in Sweden for the past couple of 100 years. There are statistics on almost everything, but you can't find good data on student achievement in schools. It's an extremely complex issue. As I said, there are a number of methodological challenges. And also, I say here that there is no evidence of increasing cost. There are a few studies that point at the possibility of increasing costs due to independent schools. But that is very weak evidence, and basically you get a positive effect and you have no evidence that it increases costs. In my study, well, you know that for a very long time, school researchers claim that there is no link whatsoever between resources devoted to education and the results. I'm a bit of a heretic there because I claim that there is such a link, and actually my study is one of the few studies that actually shows on such a link. And we made a calculation that concluded that a 1 percentage point increase in free school attendance would be equivalent to about £200 increase in spendings. And that would be, over the entire Swedish school system, about £250 million. The total cost of the school system, of course, is 10 billion or something like that. So it's a small amount, but still, if you can get that kind of effect of any kind of school policy, it's still quite amazing. So, is it big or small? Well, if you compare to other variables such as parents' background, it's a small effect, but still, it's a sizable effect. And if you look at other kinds of studies on other issues, well, if you don't trust these results, you shouldn't trust any results, basically, in school research. And in particular, you shouldn't believe in the much weaker evidence on cost and segregation, because some of the studies I have quoted, they found some evidence that there is increased segregation in the Swedish school system. And some of them find that there is an increased cost. One recent study actually showed that competition between schools increased teachers' salaries, which perhaps could increase the cost in those schools. But it's also one thing that amazes me, that you look at these studies, you find very strong evidence that quality improves, you find very weak evidence and very conflicting evidence about segregation and cost, and still you can read articles in British media and also in Swedish media that says that the main conclusion is that segregation has increased. I'll give you an indication and also almost everyone wanting better schools say that more money is one part of the solution. And I'll give you one indication of why more money is not necessarily better. This is a plot of results on costs in Swedish schools. Well, the argument could be, of course, that there are huge differences between municipalities. The cost might be different for biological reasons. So I took the data and sort of constructed expected costs based on municipality characteristics. And I got this picture, which is much different. And actually, for a long time, there was a research consensus among economists that increased resources to education didn't matter. You could throw in more teachers, you could throw in more books, but it wouldn't affect results. As I said, I'm a bit of a heretic and claim that more resources do matter. Another argument I met against the Swedish free schools is that the Swedish schools are performing poorly. That might be maybe one reason why we won the election. And how can I stand here and claim that free schools are a success in Sweden while Swedish schools are still failing? Because they are failing badly. And the answer is quite simple. Getting one thing right in education isn't enough. We have destroyed our teacher education. Now we're trying to fix it again. We have reduced the social status of teachers during a long period of time and reduced their relative salaries compared to other groups. We've had an amazing reluctance to measure achievement. There's been a strong movement in Sweden wanting to abolish all kinds of grading. Trying to fix that also. And we've had a very weak system for assessing whether or not schools are good. And also as I said, I believe there is a link between how much money you spend on schools and the results they get. And in particular, I think if you make drastic cutbacks in schools, that is going to hurt them. Before I show you a picture showing how much we cut back on Swedish schools after the financial crisis of the 90s, I'd also add another factor. There's actually a lack of teaching in Swedish schools. We deregulated the school system, and a result of that has been that teachers are seen more, and this is sort of a new pedagogical idea also, that teachers should be supervisors more than teachers. And we're trying to change that also, but that's also probably one of the reasons why performance has fallen. But let me show you what happened in Sweden. As you know, we had a severe crisis in the 90s, We had huge waste, I would say, in the Swedish schooling system, followed by a squeeze. The number of students fell due to demographic reasons, while the number of teachers hardly moved at all. And then we had a financial crisis, and we also moved responsibility for teachers from the central government to the municipal governments. And at the same time, we made drastic cutbacks on the municipalities. And well, guess where those cuts fell? They fell on the schools. Unfortunately, that was at the same time as the student population started to rise again. So finally we made cuts, which should probably have been made earlier due to falling student population. But as I said, that decrease of the number of teachers came when the number of students started to expand again. And you can look at another way by the student-staff ratio. Well, to draw one conclusion from this, to claim that the free schools are to blame for the deterioration in quality. Well, if you remember the picture again with the complex web that we try to analyze, and then you say that we have introduced free schools, and after that quality fell, and you ignore the fact that we also made drastic cuts in the school sector at the same time, and claim that the free schools are to blame, which would be quite absurd, actually. So basically, we've made several disastrous reforms, and the evidence is that the free schools make students better off. To conclude, perhaps, a couple of minutes left. To conclude, and perhaps to give a lesson for somebody as you do in Britain who want to introduce our system, it's important to understand what you're doing when you are introducing school choice or free schools. It's not a market system. We're not introducing a market. It's not like deregulating an industry and letting the market run freely. Above all, we still want subsidized education. We don't want kids to pay for going to school, which means the most important instrument of the market is lacking. We have no price coordination mechanism. So it's not a market system. We're using a market mechanism to solve problems. And what we do is we change incentives. And that is important to get that right. We have to consider how our reforms are changing the incentives. We changed incentives in the municipality I live in by introducing a full-blown voucher system already before this reform. And one teacher said, the difference now is that one extra student used to be an extra cost. Now it's money walking in the door. And that is a change of incentives that is bound to make a difference in the way he acts as in the decisions he makes. So it's important to get the incentives right. Also, when you give freedom to people to act, you also have to give them responsibility. That's also one of the mistakes we made in Sweden. We liberalized our rules, but we probably liberalized them too much. You have to have liberal rules, but stringent rules. You have to set down a curriculum that isn't too strict, that isn't too detailed, that leaves the schools room to innovate, but that at the same time it has to be strict enough so that you can ensure that students get all the education they really need. And also you have to have school inspectors with sharp teeth. That is something we have missed in Sweden also. It has been very hard to close down not only independent free schools, but also the public schools. And then a final lesson, don't forget the public schools. Frederik Bergström said that when he became party chairman, he talked to the people in our parliamentary committee for education, and asked them about school policy. And they said, everybody out at the schools, they love us. And he figured that was a bit strange. It didn't really seem to fit with his own view when he went out to met parents and teachers. And then he looked at what schools they had visited, and it turned out they only visited independent schools. When I talk about free schools, I like to say that it's silly to think that free schools would solve all problems. It's one part of the solution if we want to make our school systems better, but it's not a solution that solves all problems. But a little bit, I think the Conservative Party went into the trap to think that once we had introduced school choice and free schools, we had solved all problems in the education system. And the Social Democrats, they had their local politicians in the municipalities for years saying to them that if you give us the power, if you decentralize control over schools from the central government to the municipalities, we will solve the problem. And then they did that. And they thought that they had sort of done what they had to do when it came to schooling. Of course, also we got the tremendous economic crisis, so they were a bit preoccupied by dealing with that. But you shouldn't forget the public schools, by several reasons. First of all, the majority of students are still going to go to the public schools for the foreseeable future. And secondly, if school choice or free schools are going to work, you have to give those schools the tools to respond to incentives. There's no point of giving incentives if you don't give decision makers the power to respond to those incentives. I close there.
Thank you very much. Sure. Ladies and gentlemen, we've a little bit of time now for some questions and answers, and I'm sure there's many people in the room with the questions. Can I just thank Mikael, first off, that was a great delivery on free schools and giving us bringing us back to the academic rigors of the debate, which I think is very important in the political world that we're operating in. Can I take questions? This gentleman here.
Thank you. I'm analysing from the New Schools Network. Thank you. I don't know if it's necessary. Okay. So thank you very much. That was very enlightening indeed. I just have two small questions. One about the Swedish experience, one about the British. You mentioned that you wouldn't expect to see an effect in university education at this stage. I presume that you would expect there to be one at some stage, especially since there's now a quarter of students in upper secondaries in free schools. So at what stage and type would you expect that effect to be? Since eventually one would assume that that's part of the purpose. And then the second question is, as you watch this unfold in Britain, although it's at an early stage, what are your biggest fears, or maybe just a single thing that you think is most at risk of going wrong, and maybe what we can do to fix that? Thanks.
Well, is it over? Okay. Well, I think there is an effect on achievement later on. I just think it's extremely hard to find it. Now I'm just speculating when I say I think there is an effect, but if you get better school results, well, if you measure them in any way that's appropriate, that should have an effect on your performance after you leave school. Otherwise, we have a bigger problem. But the thing is, when you try to sort out all those different methodological issues, there's always a balance between taking account of the methodological challenges and the power of your analysis. Every control variable loses power. So when you say we have control for example, Böhlmark and Lindahl, they use siblings data. So they try to use the siblings results as a control variable for the effect of independent schools. But then you are losing huge amounts of information. What you're doing is essentially when you control for different kinds of correlation you don't want to, so the factors you want to rule out is that you're throwing away information. And that's a delicate balance, but it's not strange that you get smaller and smaller. Sort of, it's harder and harder to find any evidence when you're throwing away more and more information. So what you have to do is to collect better data, make more sophisticated analysis, and perhaps live with some of the methodological problems and say that, okay, we don't think this is important, and perhaps not only look at siblings data, but other kinds of data. As we always say, further research is needed. Oh, and the second question. As I said, I think that the most important thing is not to forget the public schools. It's very hard to reform the school system. It's a very funny episode of Yes, Prime Minister, where he sits and contemplates what he can do to reform the schools, and he finds out that there is hardly anything he can do. He ends up actually trying to introduce a school choice system, which fails, of course. But anyway, and it's true. When we sat in opposition and tried to think what tools do we have to influence our schools, it's very hard to find any good tools. It's very hard it's hard to change the schools, and it's far too easy to say that, okay, we found this thing we can do. We can introduce free schools and forget all the other things that are harder to do, but still very necessary. It's like the drunk who is looking for a key under a lamppost, and somebody walks by and says, can I help you look? And they can find it, and the guy finally asks, are you sure you dropped it here? No, I dropped it over there, but it's dark there, I can't look there. So even if it's hard, you shouldn't forget the government schools, state schools.
One question here, and then we can hear you.
Thank you. Krista Delano from the Independent Schools Council. A major concern in the UK with the introduction of free schools is accessibility. So I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about competition for places in Swedish free schools, and if you do have major oversubscription issues, how do you determine who goes?
We'll take this other question just before we... Sorry, there was someone else in the
Oh, it's me. Hi, Anna Pedroza from Teachers TV. I was just interested, picking up on your point about the importance of not forgetting public or state schools. If you could talk a little bit about the interaction between free schools in Sweden and public schools, and how effectively public schools were able to act as a catalyst for change or affecting change within the public sector.
Okay, I'll start with the first question about when there is a limited access to places in the free schools. And that is perhaps one point where I think the British government has gone astray in not accepting for-profit schools. Because in Sweden, the only way to limit access is to have a queue. We have outlawed entrance fees. So you're not if you accept government subsidies, you're not allowed to have an entrance fee. So pricing is out of the question, and you're not allowed to use a lottery, and you're not allowed to use access exams. In upper secondary school, you can use grades, but in the compulsory school, you can only use a line basically. And there's one school in Stockholm which has a line. Well, to get your kid in there, you have to put your kid in line when he or she is born, and that is not enough. They have to be born early in the year. And I called the headmaster of that school and asked, why don't you expand? And she basically said that they had a very good team of teachers, they had a good, nice building they liked, and basically it was too much trouble to expand. And that's a non-for-profit school, and it is governed by a parent board. And you also have sibling. If you have a sibling in the school, you get your second kid also in. They pass the line. And of course, they have no incentive whatsoever to expand. They already had their kids in the school. While, on the other hand, one of the most successful Swedish school chains, which is the International English School, a couple of English teachers started a school in Stockholm. Nobody believed in their idea and said it's never going to work. But the city council said, it was even before the free school reform, but the city council said, okay, we don't believe in them either, but let them try. And it was a huge success, and they got a big line and expanded and started other schools, and they don't have a waiting line, as long as at least not a big waiting line, because they expand. So that's one of the answers. You have to it's good to create incentives for schools to expand, and the profit motive is an obvious such motive. The relationship between the public schools and the free schools. Well, first of all, one important thing is that the teachers are union members to a high degree in Sweden, both in private and in public schools. And also, I would say, even though I'm a conservative politician, that the teacher unions are beneficial to Swedish students, that they do a great job and they support reforms that increase quality in Swedish schools. They are genuinely concerned about the quality of education in Sweden, and they're a positive force. So that's the first answer to the question. Teachers in both private and state schools, I mean, children as of this, municipal and whatever. What should I call it? Private and state. Let's call them private and state schools. Private and state schools, they cooperate. How it works as transfer change is very different on which municipality you live in. I'm a bit biased, of course, because I'm also on the city council in Nacka, which is outside Stockholm, and I think the public schools there are definitely an instrument for change. They are very good. Many of them they respond to competition from the independent schools. My kids have been in the public schools all the time before upper secondary school. Now one of them is in a free school in central Stockholm, which she herself selected. One of them is they have a music class, which is of course a way to attract students, and they are definitely participating sort of in the school choice reform in a way that they respond to incentives. But I know other municipalities where they only think of the free schools as a threat, and that is probably it has pretty much to do with political signals. If politicians in the local government say to their own schools that you have to compete, you should meet this challenge, they are not going to go away, cope with it, then they start coping with it. So that's also, once again, don't forget the public schools.
Another couple of questions, Elaine, and then the lady back to the room.
Hi, Elaine Simpson from Serco. Some very brief things really relating back to your presentation. First of all, the graph you showed us about the upper secondary increase seemed to suddenly, the free school movement seemed to suddenly explode in about 2002. And I wondered if that was entirely due to demographics or if something had happened at that point that suddenly made it go, because it just seemed to go whoosh. The second part was, you talked as well about the failure in the system in effect, and a lot of the noise here has laid the failure at the door of the free schools and said, oh, they've not succeeded, blah, blah, blah. And I just wondered if that failure actually has been across the system rather than specifically in the free schools, or more in the free schools, which is what some of the noise in the UK has suggested. And the third issue was that our demographic changes, we've got huge pupil growth coming through, an awful lot of it focused on in some of the tougher ethnicity areas and some of the areas with very high ethnicity. and their populations are growing hugely. And traditionally, those aren't necessarily the areas where the free schools would actually form naturally, because the parent groups, the teacher groups, etc., with that passion in the area don't always exist. And I wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Let's take that question. We'll go back there. There are 3 questions there. So on 2002, on failure and on inner city areas.
We'll check this. Okay. I don't know anything that happened in 2002. I think it's been pretty smooth, and then there are natural variations. Might have been something, but nothing that I know of. Well, the failing schools in the cities, of course, it's probably easier to start a free school in a sort of friendly environment, but again, there's no such system. Perhaps it's hard to. In my study, we find that there is such an effect, but it's even more important what the attitude of the municipal government is. We measure the attitude of the municipal government by how much contracting out they do in other areas. So, as a gauge of their attitude to private providers in public services. And that has an effect on the establishment of independent schools, but otherwise, and there is a tendency to urban areas, there's a tendency to higher income areas and so on. But there are also lots of independent schools started in poorer areas, or more disadvantaged areas. Again, going back to my own municipality, I live in a very strange neighborhood where on one side of where I live is probably the richest area in Sweden. It is one of the richest, and on the other side is a 1970s high-rise building area where there are lots of immigrants, high immigration and so on. I used to live at just around there, and they have a free school, which is one of the best schools in the entire municipality. While actually the upper secondary school in this nice neighborhood is failing terribly. They're constantly losing students, and we almost closed them down last year, but it was an election year, so they survived. So it's absolutely no clear pattern that schools are only established in sort of good areas. There's also one area about 100 kilometers north of Stockholm, which is a typical industrial, heavy industry. They have a paper mill where almost everyone works. And they have the largest, or had a couple of years ago at least, the largest proportion of free school students in the country. Because the schools were so bad that somebody decided just to set up a free school. So it's a complex picture, but you could definitely not say that they are only established in poor areas. There are also some specifically targeting immigrants.
Let's take a couple more questions to close. Gentleman here, and then right at the back. This gentleman.
Thank you, Daniel Kremen. I'm a public affairs consultant. Two questions. Firstly, I was interested, in this country, there's a very much, within the school system, there's a culture of talking about collaboration and partnership and system leadership between a local family of schools where they cooperate to plan admissions, to plan the sort of the cooperation between the schools around special educational needs and the like. I was interested to know how in practice receptive are the for-profit free schools to working with what you would call your public schools out there, to work around some of those more complex issues where one institution can't do it. And the second issue that I was very interested in is, I've been to Sweden 3 times, in 2003, 2005 and 2007, and I talked to people on the social democratic side and the conservative side, And I've noticed the last time I went out there after the election, obviously, amongst the Social Democrats, there was increasingly, vocal opposition to the free schools model, to your free model. Has that changed? Is it a result of bottom-up pressure from within the municipalities, or would you say that actually this is, from the very top down, that the attitude has changed drastically as a result of the Conservatives embracing the model so enthusiastically? Because we're seeing this in our country with increasing opposition to A, free schools, but B, also more cautious approaches from Andy Burnham to the Academies programme, than much more markedly cautious than any of his predecessors.
Take just from the microphone stand.
Brian Lipson, I work for CFBT Education Trust. In Sweden, did they introduce the profit motive from the start, or did it come a little bit after the policy developed, and how controversial was it?
Cooperation between school, I really don't know much about that, I should say, but I think there is some opposition from because I talked to a lady who worked with a Muslim school, and she said that their biggest challenge when trying to work with sort of integrate people with immigrant backgrounds, obviously in Sweden with people with Swedish background, is the opposition from the municipal schools to work with a free school. So that's a problem to be solved, obviously. But I really couldn't comment very much on that, and it's probably very different in different municipalities. Concerning the increasing opposition against the free school model, I think the answer is that we have a declining student population, which means that, and also the number of independent schools has reached such a number that they are seriously threatening the public schools, the municipal schools. In a large community such as the one I live in, and in most parts of Stockholm, it's not such a big problem because, first of all, we're growing population-wise. In other parts of the country where you may have a declining population anyway, so you have an even larger decline in student population than the national average, that's going to be a problem because one of the most unpopular decisions you can make as a local politician is to close a school. The local city councillor in Nacka, he talked about spittoon meetings. And you're, as a politician, you're the spittoon for 200 angry parents whose school you're going to close down. So that's one reason why there is perhaps growing opposition among local politicians. Another reason is that I would say that the free school market works pretty much as any other market that you open up. It starts up with enthusiasts, people who have an idea, like the International English School, a couple of teachers with something they want to test. They want to work without the limitations of the municipal bureaucracy. And then it develops. We get larger companies such as Kunskapsskolan and other companies. But you also get the proper English term would be the gold diggers that are in it for the money, and they may even be crooked. And we've had some examples of that. Schools, independent schools that are in it for the money, or they might just be incompetent. And of course, we have that in the municipal schools also. One of the worst scandals ever with abuse and religious fundamentalism and everything, all kinds of problems was in a municipal school. But nobody would say that the problems are there because it's run by the municipality. But if the same thing happens in an independent school, you say that it's because it's an independent school and they're irresponsible. So that's also perhaps one explanation. The profit motive was there from the start. I think it was, actually it's one amazing thing is that the free school reform in Sweden wasn't that controversial. It's probably because nobody thought it would have such huge impact. Everybody thought that perhaps we would get a couple of local schools, perhaps some religious organizations would find it easier to run their schools. But it wasn't that controversial. And also the profit motive, I know it was controversial within the government, but the Conservative Party won out. But that was not a big issue, because I don't think anybody envisaged that we would get many profit-running companies in the school sector. Most people thought that it would probably just be the idealists anyway. But it was there from the beginning.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's approaching 7:10. There's another engagement to go to, so we'll leave it there. But can I just ask you to join with me in a round of applause? Thank you very much.